On a scorching afternoon in August 1941, the heavy doors of the British consulate in Bilbao, Spain, swung open to reveal a sight that defied all military logic. Standing in the foyer were three men, Allied soldiers who looked every bit the part of fugitives. They were gaunt, unshaven, their boots worn through, and their eyes wide with the exhaustion of men who had been hunted across a continent. But the diplomats weren't looking at the soldiers. They were staring, open-mouthed, at the person who had brought them. Leading this group of bedraggled men was a young Belgian woman named Andrée de Jongh. She was 24 years old but looked barely 20. She was petite, attractive, and dressed not in tactical gear, but in the simple, unassuming clothes of a commercial artist or a schoolteacher. She stood there with a bright, fresh face, as if she had just returned from a casual afternoon stroll, rather than a clandestine trek across 800 kilometers of Nazi-occupied territory. The British vice-consul was baffled. To get here, this fragile girl claimed to have smuggled these men from Brussels, through the heavily policed checkpoints of Paris, down through the surveillance state of Vichy France, and finally over the Pyrenees mountains, a jagged, treacherous natural wall that separated France from Spain. In London, the reaction from British intelligence was immediate and cynical. Claude Dancy, the vice-chief of MI6, read the reports and scoffed. He was certain this was a trap. The Gestapo was known for their elaborate counterintelligence games, and this story was simply too perfect, too impossible. No young woman could navigate the most heavily guarded borders in history with such ease. They suspected she was a German agent, a honey trap designed to lure the British into exposing their secure lines. For 3 weeks, Andrée sat in limbo, waiting for London to decide her fate. The British saw a naive girl who was likely being used. The Germans, had they caught her then, would have seen a harmless child. But on that hot August afternoon, everyone was wrong. They were not looking at a trap, nor were they looking at a child. They were looking at the greatest resistance operative of the Second World War, and the very prejudice that made the British doubt her would become the exact weapon she used to humiliate the Third Reich. To understand how a commercial artist became the mastermind of an international smuggling ring, we have to look back to a childhood lived in the shadow of a ghost. Andrée de Jongh was born in Schaerbeek, Brussels, during the First World War. She was the daughter of Frédéric de Jongh, a primary school headmaster who possessed a quiet but fierce moral compass. While Andrée was physically slight, her spirit was tempestuous. Her father, recognizing her relentless energy and refusal to accept no for an answer, gave her a nickname that would prove prophetic, the Little Cyclone. But the most defining influence on her life was not a living person, but a martyr. Schaerbeek was the hometown of Edith Cavell, the legendary British nurse who had been executed by a German firing squad in 1915 for helping Allied soldiers escape occupied Belgium. For the young Andrée, Edith Cavell wasn't just a historical footnote, she was a haunting presence. Her father told her the story repeatedly, instilling in her a powerful sense of justice and the terrifying cost of resistance. While other girls played house, Andrée grew up analyzing where Cavell had failed. She revered the nurse's courage, but she was frustrated by the outcome. In her teenage diary, she didn't just express pity, she expressed a resolve to do better. She vowed that if the Germans ever returned, she wouldn't just be a martyr, she would be a victor. That dark premonition became reality on May 10, 1940. German forces invaded Belgium, crushing the country's defences in a matter of days. As the swastika was hoisted over Brussels, the 23-year-old Andrée immediately volunteered as a nurse. She began working in hospitals filled with captured British soldiers. At first, she did what many good-hearted civilians did. She helped them write letters home and gathered food. But as she watched these men languish in captivity or hide uselessly in basements across the city, something in her snapped. She realized that hiding men was a dead end. Hiding them indefinitely just made them sitting ducks for the Gestapo raids that were sure to come. More importantly, these were trained pilots and soldiers. Leaving them in a cellar in Brussels was a waste of military assets. They didn't need charity. They needed to get back to England to fight. In the spring of 1941, while the rest of Europe was paralyzed by the shock of occupation, the Little Cyclone went to work. She didn't have military training. She didn't have government funding. She simply had an idea and the audacity to execute it. She teamed up with a friend, Arnold Deppe, and a few trusted associates to form what they initially called the DDs. However, the reality of espionage hit them hard and fast. Their first attempt was amateurish. Arnold Deppe was arrested almost immediately after being infiltrated by a Belgian collaborator. It was a disastrous blow that would have sent most people into deep hiding. For Andree, it was a lesson in logistics. She realized that passion wasn't enough. She needed a system. She needed a route that was unbreakable, and she needed to lead it herself. She would not just hide the men, she would personally walk them out of hell. Andree realized that to move men across a continent swarming with police, she didn't need soldiers. She needed ghosts. She named her new network the Comet Line, a promise of the speed with which she intended to spirit the men away. To build it, she made a strategic choice that would baffle German counterintelligence for years. She recruited women. She understood the psychology of her enemy better than they understood themselves. The Nazi worldview was rigidly patriarchal. When a Gestapo officer looked for a resistance leader, he looked for a man, someone with military bearing and a square jaw. When he saw a young woman reading a magazine on a train, or a teenage girl riding a bicycle with a basket of groceries, his eyes slid right past her. To him, women were background noise. Andree weaponized that invisibility. 70% of the Comet Line's operatives were women, and the beating heart of this southern operation was the de Jongh family in the town of Anglet, near the Spanish border. The matriarch, Elvire de Jongh, known to the network as Auntie Go, was instrumental in the logistics of the escape, but the de Jongh's involvement went beyond simple hospitality. In a stroke of sublime irony, Elvire's husband, Fernand, worked as an interpreter for the German occupiers. By day, he translated their orders. By night, he stole their official stamps and blank travel permits, providing the very documents that would smuggle their enemies to safety. Even their 16-year-old daughter, Janine, served as a courier, carrying death sentences in her school bag. But having the papers wasn't enough. The men themselves were a liability. These were British and American airmen, tall, broad-shouldered, and culturally distinct. They didn't walk, talk, or eat like occupied Europeans. Before a single ticket was purchased, Andree had to put them through a rigorous acting school. She taught them that their lives depended on the smallest details. She slapped their hands if they held a cigarette between their thumb and forefinger, the American way, instead of between the index and middle fingers like a European. She corrected their walk, forcing them to abandon the confident, arm-swinging stride of a soldier for the shorter, more subdued shuffle of a civilian living under fear. She taught them to eat with their fork in the left hand, tines down, never switching hands like an American. Once they were stage-ready, the terrifying journey began. The train ride from Paris to the south was a masterclass in psychological torture. Andree would sit in a carriage, often surrounded by German officers, with her parcels, the code name for the airmen, scattered nearby. The rule was absolute silence. They were to hide behind newspapers and never look her in the eye. It was during these journeys that the dynamic shifted. These men were fighter pilots and bomber crews, the masters of the sky, accustomed to controlling four-engine machines of war. But on the ground, stripped of their uniforms and language, they were helpless. Andree became their absolute authority. She adopted the code name Dédé, which translated to Little Mother. She would look these terrified young men in the eye and say, "I am the Little Mother, and you are my little children." It wasn't just a code name, it was a command. For the duration of the trip, she owned them. If the train ride was a test of nerves, the final leg of the journey was a test of raw physical endurance. The route ended in the foothills of the Pyrenees, the jagged natural fortress separating France from Spain. This was the death march. Here, the operation shifted from the psychological to the brutal. To navigate the mountains, Andree relied on a man who was her physical opposite in every way, Florentino Goicoetxea. Florentino was a Basque smuggler, a giant of a man with hands like shovels and the constitution of an ox. He knew every goat path, every hidden ravine, and the precise timing of every Wehrmacht guard rotation in the mountains. He was an unpolished, illiterate brute of nature, and he was absolutely vital. The crossing took place at night, regardless of the weather. They had to cover roughly 20 kilometers of steep, rocky terrain, wading through the freezing, fast-moving currents of the Bidassoa River, often with Nazi sentries and their dogs just a few hundred yards away in the darkness. This is where the Little Cyclone truly earned her name. The airmen she was guiding were often in terrible shape. Some were burned from their plane crashes, others were malnourished or nursing sprained ankles. They were aviators, not mountaineers. Halfway up the ascent, with rain lashing their faces and their lungs burning. Many would simply hit their breaking point. They would collapse in the mud, weeping, ready to surrender just to make the pain stop. Andree, weighing less than 100 pounds, became a force of nature. She didn't offer them pity. She offered them steel. She would grab these large, broken men by their collars, hauling them to their feet. She would whisper shout into their faces, threatening them, cajoling them, pushing them forward inch by inch. When threats failed, she used her own body as a living crutch, letting men twice her size lean on her as they stumbled toward freedom. The stakes of these crossings were astronomically high, and not just for moral reasons. In the cold calculus of war, Andree was trafficking in high-value assets. The British government estimated that training a single bomber pilot cost around £10,000, a fortune in the 1940s. A fighter pilot cost even more. By saving these men, Andree wasn't just saving sons and husbands. She was returning millions of dollars of tactical investment back to the Royal Air Force. She was effectively replenishing the Allied air power, one exhausting step at a time. For 24 round trips, she defied the odds. She walked into Spain, delivered her children to the British diplomats, and then, incredibly, she turned around. She left safety behind and walked back over the mountains, back into the enemy's grip, to find more men. She did this not because she was fearless, but because she knew that without her, the system would stall. She was the engine of the Comet Line, and she refused to stop running. But in the clandestine world of espionage, perfection is impossible to maintain forever. The Comet Line had grown too large, its reputation too legendary. The Gestapo knew someone was moving hundreds of men under their noses, and they began a ruthless campaign to sever the head of the snake. Since they couldn't find the root from the outside, they decided to destroy it from within. The threat arrived wearing the face of a friend. His real name was Jacques de Soubry, but to the resistance, he was known as Jean Masson. He presented himself as an eager, patriotic volunteer, desperate to help the cause. In reality, he was a traitor of the worst kind, a Belgian working directly for the German secret police. He didn't just stumble upon the network, he hunted it. He infiltrated the line, gained their trust through calculated lies, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on January 15th, 1943. Andree was at a safe house in the village of Urugne, deep in the French Basque country. She was preparing for yet another crossing with 3 British airmen. Outside, the weather was turning, the heavy clouds signaling a difficult climb ahead. Inside, the atmosphere was warm. They were sharing a final meal before the march, blissfully unaware that their location had been sold to the enemy. Suddenly, the farmhouse doors burst open. Field grey uniforms flooded the room. The airmen were seized and pinned to the floor before they could even stand. Andree stood amidst the chaos, watching the faces of the men she had sworn to protect. She realized instantly that this wasn't a random patrol. The timing was too precise. They had been betrayed. She was hauled away to a villa in Bayonne for interrogation, and later to the notorious Fresnes prison near Paris. It was here, in the cold, sterile rooms of the Gestapo headquarters, that the final, most profound irony of Andrée de Jongh's war played out. The German interrogators were convinced they had caught a significant cell, but they refused to believe they had caught the leader. They looked at Andree, this petite, disheveled young woman, and saw nothing more than a courier, a helper, or perhaps a girlfriend caught up in her lover's mess. They demanded to know the identity of the mastermind. Who was the man running this operation? Was it her father? Was it a British agent? Andree looked them in the eye and told them the absolute truth. "I am the leader," she said. "I established the line. I created the route. I give the orders." The Gestapo officers laughed. They literally laughed in her face. Their indoctrination, their rigid belief in the superiority of men, simply would not allow them to process the information. To them, it was biologically and intellectually impossible for a 24-year-old girl to outsmart the entire Third Reich for 2 years. They believed she was lying to protect a man, a mythical male figure they were desperate to find. They interrogated her for hours, employing their brutal methods, demanding a name that didn't exist. Andree never wavered. She took full responsibility for every life saved, every border crossed, but the more she insisted she was the boss, the less they believed her. This disbelief became her salvation. Under the Nazi night and fog decree, the leaders of resistance networks were typically executed immediately after interrogation. Her father, Frederick, would later be caught and shot for his role because the Germans respected him enough to fear him. But Andree, because the Nazis dismissed her as a minor figure, a mere pawn in a man's game, they decided she wasn't worth the bullet. Instead of a firing squad, they sentenced her to the concentration camps. She was stripped of her freedom, but she had won the psychological war. And even as the prison doors clanged shut behind her, her greatest achievement revealed itself. She had built a system so robust, so compartmentalized, that it survived the loss of its creator. Her deputy, Jean-François Nothomb, stepped into the void, and the parcels continued to move. The Germans had the architect in custody, but the machine she built kept running, fueled by her blueprint and the courage she had instilled in every link of the chain. Andree disappeared into the night and fog. For the next 2 years, she descended into the deepest circles of human suffering. She was moved first to Ravensbrück, the notorious women's concentration camp, and later to Mauthausen. If the Pyrenees had been a test of physical endurance, the camps were a test of the soul. The conditions were designed to strip prisoners of their humanity before killing their bodies. Andree was starved, overworked, and subjected to the constant, terrifying whims of the SS guards. But even here, stripped of her name and reduced to a number, the little mother did not disappear. In the midst of the filth and death, Andree found a way to resist that didn't involve maps or escape routes. She returned to her roots as a nurse. Though she had no medicine, no bandages, and no equipment, she organized clandestine support networks within the barracks. She shared her meager rations with those who were fading. She sat with the dying, whispering words of comfort so they wouldn't pass into the dark alone. Caring for others became her survival mechanism. It was the only way to retain her own humanity in a place designed to destroy it. But while Andree fought to stay alive, the war claimed the person she loved most. Her father, Frédéric, the man who had first told her the story of Edith Cavell and sparked the fire in her heart, was not as fortunate. He had been arrested in Paris in June 1943. Unlike his daughter, the Germans did not underestimate him. They saw him as a leader. On March 28, 1944, Andrée de Jongh was executed by firing squad at Mont-Valérien. Before he died, he managed to smuggle out a final letter. In it, he didn't write of fear or regret. He wrote of pride. He told his daughter that he was at peace because he knew what they had achieved together. He addressed her one last time by the name he had given her as a child, his Little Cyclone. He was just one of many. The cost of the Comet Line was staggering. By the end of the war, an estimated 290 of the network's volunteers, men and women who had opened their doors, forged papers, and guided strangers, had been executed or died in the camps. They paid the ultimate price to keep the line open, a testament to the loyalty Andree inspired. When the US Army finally liberated Mauthausen in April 1945, they found Andrée de Jongh among the survivors. She was unrecognizable. Tuberculosis had ravaged her lungs, and she weighed less than 80 pounds. She was a skeletal shadow of the vibrant young woman who had walked into the British consulate 4 years earlier. She returned to a Belgium that wanted to celebrate her. The British awarded her the George Medal, the Americans, the Medal of Freedom, the French, the Legion of Honor. She was made a countess. She was a living legend, a Joan of Arc for the 20th century. She could have spent the rest of her life in Brussels, dining on her fame, writing memoirs, and accepting the adoration of the terrifying number of men she had saved. But Andree did something that stunned everyone. She walked away. She left Europe. She left the medals in a drawer and the applause behind her. She traveled to the Belgian Congo, then to Ethiopia, then to Senegal. She didn't go as a diplomat or a dignitary. She went to finish what she had started before the world went mad. She spent the next several decades working in leper colonies. Years later, the famous English novelist Graham Greene tracked her down in a remote leper hospital in Africa. He asked her why. Why would a war hero choose a life of obscurity among the outcasts of society? Andree looked at him with the same burning intensity she had once turned on the British diplomats. She explained that this wasn't a new chapter. It was the original plan. "I wanted to cure lepers since I was 15, she said. The war was just an interruption. It was a profound revelation. The world saw her as a warrior, but Andree had always seen herself as a healer. Whether she was smuggling airmen over mountains to save them from a firing squad, or bandaging the wounds of leprosy patients to save them from social exile, the mission was identical. She was simply someone who refused to leave people behind. Andrée de Jongh died in 2007 at the age of 90. Her legacy is one of the most statistically impressive of the entire war. 776 Allied personnel rescued. That is 776 men who went home, who fathered children, who built lives, and whose descendants number in the thousands today. Her story stands as the ultimate rebuke to prejudice. The British intelligence officers saw a liability. The Gestapo officers saw a harmless little girl. They were both blinded by their own assumptions. They couldn't see the steel spine beneath the fragile frame, but the history books see her clearly now. To the Nazis, she was a ghost they couldn't catch. To the historians, she is a giant. But to those 776 shivering young men on the dark slopes of the Pyrenees, she was simply mother.